I'd like to welcome everyone to today's seminar on the occasion of World Water Day. So on this occasion, we're going to talk about water rights and how communities around the world are working to secure their rights to drinking water. And this will be a conversation with activists and academics. And two of them I'll introduce in a minute. But first, I want to say that my name is Siri Gloppen. I'm the director, one of the directors of the Center on Law and Social Transformation, which is hosting today's seminar jointly with Bergen Global. And with me here, I'll start here with Bruce Wilson. So Bruce is also part of LawTransform, the Center on Law and Social Transformation, and he is directing a project at the center, which is which is the occasion why we are doing this today. And the project is called Elevating Water Rights to Human Rights. Has it strengthened marginalized people's claim to water? And that, of course, is the question that we are posing today. So it's very appropriate. And Bruce is, in addition to being a law transformer, he's a professor of political science at the University of Central Florida. He is an affiliated research professor at the Christian Michelsen Institute in Bergen. And he has done a lot of research on, particularly related to politics in Central and South America, particularly Central America and Costa Rica. I don't think anyone in the world outside of Costa Rica knows as much about Costa Rica as Bruce does. And so we're looking forward to hearing from you. And then the convener and chair of today's seminar, who is Angela Paez, who's an assistant professor at the Department of Public Administration at Tennessee University, and also a PhD in public administration, and a master's in administrative law and a law degree from Universidad del Rosario in Colombia. And you're Colombian. And we'll also be joined by another Colombian later on. Angela's research interests include law and public administration, courts and rights protection, and water governance. And I leave to Angela to introduce the invisible part for you who are here in the room of our panel. And I look so much forward to learning from you both and you all.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Siri. Welcome everyone to our World Water Day event. We have called Stories of Local Water Governance. I want to welcome everyone who's here with us in the audience in Bergen, and also welcome everyone who's joining us on Zoom. Well, first let me thank LawTransform City for providing support for this exciting event. It's been a wonderful opportunity to be here with this in this vibrant academic community. I also wanted to thank our research project, Elevating Water Rights to Human Rights. It has provided a wonderful space over a few years of reflecting, thinking through water issues. That is what's bringing us today together. And today we want to put the spotlight on local water governance. Through these years, we have thought through the challenges and opportunities that exist in communities, fighting to advance their right to have, drinking water. And oftentimes we tend to look at the national level, international efforts to bring drinking water, but we tend to forget sometimes these activists, these people who are actually in the ground trying to advance and protect water rights. So that's what we want to look into today. And actually we have two of our first speakers are water activists in two different countries, and I'll be introducing them briefly. The format for panel today, we have these two activists to begin with, then we have a panel of academics. Some folks are going to be online and I'll be introducing them in a minute. And then at the end, we have a space for questions from the audience. So please keep that in mind, keep your questions close, and that hopefully will be the kind of more active part of our event today. So without more delay, let me get started. And I'm more than excited to share with you to present our two speakers, the water activists. The first one is Nika Kovač. She holds a master's degree in social and cultural anthropology from the University of Ljubljana and is the director of the Institute of 8th March. She is a water activist in Slovenia, and she was one of the leaders in the campaign against the Water Act in Slovenia, which resulted in winning the water referendum. We'll also hear Maya Pinzón. She recorded a video sharing with us her experiences in Colombia. She is a sociologist and a member of the network of community managed water plants in Bogota and Cundinamarca, and a member of the National Network of Community Managed Water Plants in Colombia. In our panel of academics, we have Andrea Restrepo, also a fellow Colombian. She's a postdoc fellow at the University of Pennsylvania. Her research focuses on progressive cities, water and sanitation, and planning for climate change adaptation in cities in the Global South. We will also hear from Arkaja Singh. She's a fellow at the Center for Policy Research and a part of the State Capacity Initiative at CPR. Her current work is focused on regulation of markets. She has several other areas of interest that include municipal government, informal settlements, land, water, and sanitation, and the interface of law and the Indian administrative state. Arkaja studied law at the National Law School of India University, Bangalore, and has an LLM from the School of Oriental and African Studies in London. Then we have Bruce Wilson, who Sidi introduced him. He's a professor of political science at the University of Central Florida. And he is the leader of our research project on elevating water rights to human rights. Also with us in the panel online is going to be Inga Winkler. She's an associate professor in international human rights at the Central European University in Vienna in Austria. Her research focuses on socioeconomic rights and their intersections with gender justice and sustainable development. And then we will also have the company of Charles Epp, who's a distinguished professor at the School of Public Affairs and Administration at the University of Kansas. His teaching and research focuses on law, social change, and administrative reform, with a particular emphasis on rights and racial discrimination. He held an annual lecture on law and social transformation here in 2016, and he's going to be leading us, guiding us towards the Q&A at the end of the event. So let's just get started. Our first guest speaker is Nika. The floor is yours.
Hi, I am right now based in US, so for me it's early morning, but so happy to be here. Basically, I will put the stopwatch, not to be too long. So my story is basically how my organization became a group who was fighting for protecting waters, and how we basically started this fight that ended in the end of July this summer. We are an organization which is basically dealing with question of economic inequalities of poverty and gender. And last year we started a grassroots campaign, Yes Means Yes, for redefinition of law about rape. And we always work a lot on the street. We always collect signatures, because in Slovenia you can put the law into the parliament if you collect enough signatures signed in the official offices. And you can also call for the referendum. So when the law, which main intent was to basically privatize water shares and damage the access to clean drinking water in Slovenia was accepted, non-governmental organizations, which are mostly dealing with environment in Slovenia, decided that they will call for the referendum. But their biggest problem was that they didn't know how to work on the field, what to do, and basically how to collect signatures for the referendum, and they asked us for help. And we didn't have a clue what we are doing. We didn't understand basically the main core questions of the topics. What we understood is that basically the government is doing the privatization, and this is something that we fight against. But later on, speaking with all those professionals and activists, we discovered that this is our core topic, that the act that government wanted to do was basically damaging the social relations in Slovenia. In Slovenia, we have free access to all the lakes, to all the to the sea. Making the buildings is forbidden 2 kilometers like close to the water. So basically, the water is really like a public domain. It is everyone can come there, anyone can be there, and it is a value in Slovenia. So we said, let's go to the referendum. In one night, we created a slogan. Our slogan was, the destiny of water is in our hands. But what we did is that I basically fought a lot with academics, I'm so sorry, and with professionals, because we said people need to understand. People don't understand complex things in terms of like really long explanations. People need like a simple and short statements, which are basically proven by the facts. So we went with our agenda, which was let's protect the water, let's fight against like neoliberal laws, let's fight against elites, and let's take the destiny of water in our hands. And what happened, it was magical. We needed to collect 40,000 signatures on the street. We ended up with collecting 60,000 signatures in times of COVID. We had field groups all across Slovenia, and because the system of coordination of the campaign was really diverse, a lot of different people joined. There was a lot of feminist organizations, there was a lot of environmental organizations, but what is more important, there were a lot of volunteers. And basically what we were doing throughout the whole signature collection is that we were searching the local stories, how people are connected with water, how people feel because of their access to the water, and cases from Austria where we know that you need to pay if you want to visit a lake. So when the referendum was called, I was stupid enough to say that I will coordinate it. And 2 days before the official start of the campaign, I discovered that we don't have the money, that we don't have the office, that we didn't have basically anything. But what happened is that people joined, people came together, people were writing letters to each other about how important it is to have like access to the water. Trade union of taxi drivers organized themselves to drive people to the polling stations. And what we did is also that we were really harsh to the government. Every single time that they were lying, we prepared fact checks with professionals and with the experts, and we sent them to the media and did a lot of press conference. So basically, long story short, at the end, more than 80% of the country voted with us. It was the biggest mobilization campaign for the referendum in Slovenian history. Almost half of the country came and voted, and the water connected the people. But for me, it is more important that it opened the space for two things. The first thing is like questioning the agenda of politics, questioning the privatization, questioning the social relations. And second, we prove that we have the power, that people are power. And we are really proud when we say we will organize a referendum, because usually governments move away the law which they are presenting.
Thank you so much, Nika. That was fascinating. Now, next we have our second water activist who's going to share with us her experiences in Colombia. She recorded a video. We'll have up in a minute. We'll see she's speaking in Spanish and we have the captions in English. So here is Maya
Bueno, un
Pinzón.
cordial saludo a los participantes en este evento. Hoy quisiera hablarles sobre la gestión comunitaria del agua en Colombia. Agradecer la invitación también y bueno, primero un contexto muy breve de este tema en nuestro país. En Colombia, cerca de 12 millones de personas, según datos oficiales, no tienen acceso al agua en sus viviendas. Es decir, ni agua cruda ni agua de ninguna manera. Las más perjudicadas pues, son las mujeres y los niños en su salud principalmente y las mujeres en el gasto de tiempo y dedicación a conseguir el agua, a transportarla, a poder acceder a ella por su rol de cuidado asignado culturalmente. Bueno, frente a esta situación, históricamente en este país las comunidades se han organizado para gestionar el agua. Entonces, lo que llamamos acueductos comunitarios son organizaciones autogestionarias que se basan en tres principios fundamentales. Uno, la relación directa con la fuente. Son comunidades que se organizan para cuidar la fuente que los abastece. De ella depende su vida. Y ven el agua como un bien común para la vida, no solo para su consumo, sino para conservar el ecosistema mismo que la mantiene. con acciones de cuidado, de protección y de mantenimiento de las fuentes hídricas. La otra característica es en la relación con lo económico. Son organizaciones sin ánimo de lucro que buscan el beneficio común redistribuyendo y trabajando sobre la base de la solidaridad. Esta relación económica, pues en que todos aportan desde sus posibilidades, es una característica muy propia. De acuerdo con las normas nacionales se llama economía solidaria, pero bueno, es una forma de redistribuir los esfuerzos de todos, la solidaridad de todos, y bueno, relacionada también con la siguiente característica, y es la toma colectiva de decisiones. Toman decisiones desde lo más simple, como quién va a cuidar la tubería, qué obras se van a realizar, cuánto va a ser el aporte de la comunidad, decisiones que se hacen de forma asamblearia, una democracia en vivo y en directo. En Colombia hay cerca de 15.000 organizaciones de este tipo que no cuentan con el apoyo del Estado, salvo algunas excepciones en territorios muy precisos. El caso de Bogotá, que cuenta con un decreto, una norma que obliga a que las instituciones apoyen a estas organizaciones, y en el caso de Villavicencio, donde se creó la política pública para apoyar a los acueductos comunitarios. Son casos bien interesantes. También en Nariño se logró un avance en crear normas hacia el apoyo a la gestión comunitaria del agua. Bueno, desde el 2007 más o menos, a raíz del referendo por el agua, aquí constitucionalmente no tenemos reconocimiento del agua como derecho humano fundamental y como bien común. Entonces, en ese tiempo se buscó recoger muchas firmas para que en la Constitución fuera modificada y se reconociera el agua como derecho humano fundamental. Digamos que no se logró que se hiciera esa modificación constitucional, pero sí se logró a través de esta campaña que se encontraran muchas organizaciones, entre esas los acueductos comunitarios, que desde entonces empezamos a juntarnos a nivel nacional, empezamos a unir esfuerzos, encontrándonos cada año en forma asamblearia, en formas territoriales primero, por municipio, por departamento, por región, y luego a nivel nacional, para construir una ley propia que reconozca la gestión comunitaria del agua como un derecho. No solo el agua como derecho humano fundamental, que va incluido también, sino el derecho a la autogestión comunitaria del agua, porque el enfoque de las normas en nuestro país es un enfoque mercantilista, lo que ha llevado a sin número de casos de mercantilización del agua, creando casos de injusticia hídrica, donde las comunidades quedan privadas del agua para beneficiar a grandes empresas, extractivistas, agroindustriales, represas, y bueno, ese es el riesgo que tienen los acueductos comunitarios. Muchísimas gracias.
Well, thank you so much. And I want to take a brief pause here to thank Nika and Maya for sharing with us the stories, because they definitely remind us and kind of highlight that beyond the academic discourse, the concepts, this is a reality for many people. That's why we're engaged in this type of conversations, but we cannot forget or kind of detach the energy, the efforts that is taken from these folks to actually advance and promote this causes. So that's why we wanted to start the event with their testimonies, and we're grateful for that. Now, let's move to the second part of the event, the panel with academics. It's a busy panel, and I want to thank my fellow panelists for bearing with us this 5-minute, time limit. I know it's tight, but just to keep it going, we're going to keep track of time. You might receive a notice in the chat for folks who are there, and I might give Bruce a look when the time is coming close to done. So hopefully we get the conversation, keep it moving forward. So first we have Andrea. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. So actually, this is a perfect segue because I too will be sharing a bit of a story of water governance at the local level in Colombia. And what I want to focus on is actually water affordability. So as we heard from Maya, there were some campaigns in the early 2000s to try to get water to be recognized at the national level. That didn't pan out. But what happened during that time was that a lot of social movements and community-based organizations at the local level started implementing different strategies to try to make segue, both at the national level as well as at the local level. So at the national level, it was more of a contentious politics type of story where there were demands, something that in Colombia is called a tutela, and different processes along those lines. At the local level, what we see are different strategies. On the one hand, for example, and let me focus on Medellin, which was the first city in Colombia to implement a water lifeline. At the local level, what we have is that social movements and community-based organizations start working with local bureaucrats, taking basically advantage of a new instrument that was being piloted in the country, which anyone who has studied local governments in the global south knows that it's something that was very innovative, which was participatory budgeting. And so participatory budgeting was seen more as a citizenship building strategy to get people involved in having a stake and making demands on budgets in the local government. However, what happened in Medellin was that this was appropriated or used as a strategy by water activists in order to demand that the city start thinking about providing water lifelines. And so let me take a pause here and talk a little bit about what are water lifelines. So water lifelines are basically a basic allowance of water. In the case of Medellin, for example, it's 50 liters of water per person per day. But other cities in Colombia that have also adopted this have done a little bit differently. Instead of being per person, they do it per household. So for example, Bogota, which was the second city in the country to adopt this strategy, has 6 cubic meters per household per month. So they started talking about, okay, how do we create a water lifeline? And actually what ended up happening was that in working through participatory budgeting and continuing with contentious politics strategies like mobilizations, protests, lawsuits against the local government, they were able to get the local government to pilot this program. Now, that in itself was a big win. Why? Because it meant that since the national court had already ruled that this was not something that was going to be mandated at the national level, it meant that the local government had to go about understanding what were the legal requirements in order to actually make this happen in a legal way so that it wouldn't be turned down. And so what we see is that they were able to find a way to make this happen. They started working with the main service provider in the city, which is called EPM, or Public Services of Medellin, very well-known corporatized water utility for anyone who studies the Global South. And they were able to get this off the ground. But what's interesting also is that they didn't only work with EPM, they also started working and developing these contracts with 22 community-based aqueducts. And so we see that it's not just a program that works with, the big, shiny, well-known corporatized utility, but it actually really does try to reach as much of a public as it can. And so what we have then is that the city was able to institutionalize this, basically turn it into a permanent public policy that it's now under its 4th mayor. That's no small feat for a city or for cities that actually see a change in political hands every 4 years. There's no re-election of mayors, which means that usually, and it's a very fragmented political environment. So usually mayors from different parties come in every 4 years and change a lot of the public policies that are in place. But this is one that we actually see has continuity. And then it then became an example where cities like Pasto, Manizales, other smaller cities in Colombia were able to come in and take some lessons from there. So it's a story of one, social movements that are using contentious strategies as well as communication strategies, and 2, bureaucrats that within the city government are working with these community-based organizations, with these social movements, and basically working as a bridge between community needs and the local government to ensure that something that is needed by the local population can be adopted. And with that, I'll hand over the floor. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrea. Let's then move now to Arkaja. Arkaja, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Hello, and thank you, Angela. I will get straight into my story. Can you hear me?
Yes, really well. Thank you.
Yeah. So I'll get straight into my story about local governance and water in India. And I was looking at municipal bureaucracies in Indian cities and the issue around water access in urban slums. Now, the reason why I started to look at this is because the courts in India have declared the right to water to be a constitutionally recognized right. So it wasn't written in the constitution, but it was, it's quite well and clearly recognized by the courts. But, in spite of this, it's seldom demanded by social movements or people on the ground or by disadvantaged groups. It's also almost never brought up in the context of drinking water alone, but seems to be appended to other issues like environmental pollution, displacement, slum evictions, and battles over natural resources. So I looked to see what disadvantaged groups were doing instead. This is the reason why I started. I knew that local governance is the place to look at, but this is, the perspective from which I looked at it. And, this irony of the right to water being quite well recognized at one level in the legal system, but that people seldom cite this entitlement when they actually have to negotiate access through municipal administration. And this municipal administration has a different kind of a special regime through which people actually negotiate this access. And, in this world of municipal administration, the court's recognition of the right to water doesn't seem to count for very much. But the municipal administration has its own inexorable logic of poverty alleviation. And perhaps behind this, some diffuse notion of human entitlement, which provides the impetus for constructing, quite a complicated pathway for access. Now, what is the issue really that this is about the urban slums in Indian cities who seem to have a poorer claim on water supply to city water supply and resources. And this means that they are much less likely to have an in-house tap as compared to people in the same city and in comparable areas which are not demarcated as slums. In a recent week, we tried to measure this in data terms, and in a recent conversation with the Indian government's Ministry of Urban Affairs, we referred to this phenomena as the slum penalty. So what is the slum penalty? And this issue is entangled at multiple levels of land and planning regulation. The settlements that we call slums have various types of planning irregularity. They could have been built without first having an approved development plan on paper, or they could have even been set up long before the planning regulation came in. So, in theory, they are, they're not illegal because they existed before the regulation, such as old city areas and villages that come within the expanding urban area. And obviously, this means that not all areas that we are calling slums are squatter settlements in the sense of people coming and squatting on somebody else's land. But many of them still lack full and adequate documentation of their title. This could be people in old village areas also. And there could be technical weaknesses in their title. And, I've looked at what types of weaknesses, and they're numerous, and, they're quite location specific, and you can legalistically kind of untangle what are the different types of weaknesses, and they are like they defy having a number. But anyway, how does this affect drinking water? We are talking about house connections here. So in some cases, there is an actual legal rule that gets in the way of access, but that's quite rare. Most of the time, the rule framework, the water connection is contingent on the applicant getting a series of no objection certificates from various landowning agencies and government authorities, assembling a whole series of documentary proofs and government recognitions of the settlement and the person's house in some form of government register or record. Now, why do they need to climb through these multiple hoops? There's no real rational reason why, but I tried to understand it, and I tried to have many conversations with people to try and understand what it is. And I could identify a few different ways of looking at it. One is the idea that a lot of people have that the proliferation of slums, that, if they provided people with full-scale, legitimate, in-house access to water, it would lead to the proliferation of slums, freeloader advantages, perverse incentives, or whatever you might want to call it. The Pani Haq Samiti case, which I've referred to in a recent paper, is also a good example of this type of concern, which is often articulated in court rulings and in conversations with officials. But there's another layer to this. There's a lower layer to this, which is perhaps a more realistic layer. This is that the officials on the ground who actually have to sign off on the application for the water connection or on a project to lay water pipelines, they need some form of ratification of the tenure and planning status of the people who are there. And they need to be able to say it's legitimate and that people have been around for a long time and that the official is not participating in a land grab or something like that. So it's a kind of ex post ratification because those ex ante approvals were not there. There's also an engineering side to this, which is very closely linked to the legal side. And the slums, the slums could be in difficult to access areas. This is common in cities across the global south. I think slums are in difficult to access areas, hilly slopes, narrow streets. And the settlements could have been overlooked in the city's engineering plans. So it's not so easily connectable to mainline services. I mean, we're recently dealing with a case of slums in a city in Ranchi, where those people have had good freehold, good legal titles since 1930, but they're only now getting access to in-house water connections, and they've been overlooked in all the city's engineering plans until this point because of that nature of they're not illegal, but they're just informal. Now, thankfully, none of this is needed for community taps and tanker services. And it's also in the context of the larger global conversation, it's also worth pointing out that privatization and the commercialization of services isn't such a big issue in my analysis. And it's not what drives the reluctance to provide house connections. So people could, in theory, get full-scale access, but it's a difficult process to navigate. And in order to be able to navigate this process, they might need some forms of collective mobilization, political sponsorship, and a lot of their own time and money. These are also people who perhaps live with a background threat of evictions, other forms of informality, the lack of licensing for their trades and businesses, various things that might make them a little less keen to become too visible to the state or to annoy the people who matter. And it's for these reasons that they settle for a low risk approach. So, what did I understand from this is that that for rights to be meaningful, they need to engage with this, this level of intricate legal detail and to deal with the legitimate fear of evictions and tenure risk that people face. And so, to consider how rights fare in the interface between poor people and the state and the multiple kinds of vulnerabilities that people face at the same time. There's no clear-cut answer to this that works in all situations, except perhaps to think at every point of interface and in that everyday interaction of people with the state, how do you make things more empowering for the people concerned in relation to the state? So yeah, with that, I'm done, Angela, and I'll hand this back to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Arkaja. Now we have next, Bruce.
Thank you. Thank you for being here. It's very nice to be back in Bergen after a pandemic sabbatical of 2 years. So this project, it actually started off with this idea of, so the human right to water starts in 2010, like the formal declaration. It's unilaterally agreed to. Many countries signed up for it. Becomes in effect. And the question is really, so what does it matter? There's a lot of excitement when this happened. I mean, people really thought this was the beginning of a whole new process for getting water to people. And this is the core here, right? And so the dependent variable, what we're looking at is how many more people at the end of this have access to water than had at the beginning, right? And this is sort of an interesting way to think about this, is like in political science, they talk about the intervening variable, and that is the change in the creation of this right. And so we were interested to see, well, what happens to marginalized people within this? Do they get like lifted up with the right, and they can articulate the right and claim this right in a way that they couldn't before because it didn't exist? So right here, I want to try and talk about two different projects or two different parts of this project that looks at this. And they sort of dovetail with much of what we've heard already about the importance of local actors and local government. So the first one's actually, this is more like a shameless advertisement for a plug for a book here that's coming out next month on the human right to water in Costa Rica. And why Costa Rica? Well, one, because I worked there, but two, much more importantly, Costa Rica has one of the highest levels of access to portable, drinkable, like water. Like it's affordable, it's accessible, it's portable. There are only two countries in the whole of Latin America where you can actually go there and drink water from the tap. One is Costa Rica, the other one is Uruguay. The rest of them, you're going to get sick, so just don't do it. So, but this is sort of an interesting pattern. Okay, maybe Colombia, doubtful. I'm talking about the whole country, not just like big cities, right? And this is it's an interesting outlier in terms of water access. But what's also interesting is that when we look at the aggregate data for different countries, right, when you start to drill down and you look at the more local level, you find even in high-performing countries like Costa Rica, there are actually significant divergence between the national norm and the local norm, right? And water is, after all, in most countries, a local provisioned good. Okay, whether you want to look at it good or not, right? It's an item that is provisioned locally, often by local governments using local finances. And so it makes it important then to look down and find out what's happening. And in Costa Rica, you also start to see that there are differences, depending if you live in Limón on the East Coast, it's going to be very, very different than if you live in the city of San Jose in the center. And so this is sort of interesting to find, well, why do we have these differences? And what we find in Costa Rica is that the differences are getting bigger. And they get bigger as there's more urbanization. It gets bigger as climate change gets worse. It gets bigger when you have these struggles between like either mining concerns, like the right to development versus the right to water, right? So these sort of clashes take place all over the place, and it affects the ability to gain access to water. So in the book, it's broken into these chapters, and each one looks at a different strategy for claiming the right to water. And so one deals with like lobbying, which we've heard here, right? I mean, sometimes it's like at the national level, sometimes it's a local level, sometimes it's at the bureaucratic level, right? Sometimes it's way easy to go to in Costa Rica, the case is the AYA, the Water Provision Government Agency, and talk to them directly and explain your case than it is to go to a politician who probably is not that interested in your problem, okay? But another way of accessing water in Costa Rica has been through the courts. Costa Rica has a very, very open court, like the Colombian court, and it allows people to file cases individually, often at the local level, right? It's a national court, but it's a small country, right? So even though water is provisioned differently across the country, the court itself, you can file at the Supreme Court yourself in person for a particularistic concern. But when this project started, we actually asked about this whole legal and litigative aspect to the cases. And we had a water panel of practitioners and lobbyists and stuff. And we asked, so the human right to water, was it important? Oh yeah, they said, absolutely. He says, well, when you litigate, do you use this right? No, you don't, right? And this sort of fits in with what Arkaja was saying in the Indian case. Water is often tied up with all sorts of other rights. And when you're going to litigate, you're going to look to see what was successful before. Okay, and if what is successful is the right to housing being tied to the right to water, then that's what you're going to do, because you know what the jurisprudence is, it's accessible, and then that's the case you're going to make. You wouldn't necessarily, even when the human right to water came out as an international right, which when Costa Rica signed on it, it makes it a right in the country. So you could claim it, but they don't claim it. Right? It doesn't make it irrelevant. In other countries, it's going to be relevant. So we just briefly talk about the other one the other project that we did, where we looked at is a large end study. That is, we look at every country in the world, and we look to see which types of countries do best at providing water. Well, the obvious answer, right, is well, richer ones do better than poorer ones, right? And so, like, in the richer countries, there is very, very little variance in how much water is provided to the citizens. Regime type, you would think matters, and it does on the margin, like democracies do, well, it's actually not entirely clear, but seem to do slightly better than autocracies. But what does matter is local democracy. You can actually have local democracy in dictatorships, right? It seems counterintuitive, but it's actually possible. And so the ones that do have democratic local governments, competitive democratic local governments, provide water regardless of income level at a much better rate than ones that don't, right? And then the ones that have long surviving local democracies provide even better, right? Which is an interesting sort of way to look at this, right? And it's an interesting finding in looking at the whole world's access to basic water. It's not improved water, it's portable, right? But it's not, this is a measure problem, right? So you can measure basic water. Countries do this routinely, but they don't measure like the higher level of quality of water in a way that we would like them to. But what we find here is that local democracy is actually important, significantly important. And then the older the local democracy, the even more important that it is. Okay, I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. Now we have Inga. And let me briefly show you. Well, Inga, I'm sorry I interrupted you. She was supposed to be here in Bergen with us. Her flight got canceled, yet here we are. Thank you, technology. We miss you, but thank you for being with us.
Well, it's better than not to be there at all, but I wish I could have been in Bergen with you. Well, thanks so much for the kind invitation. And as you said, I'm based in Austria, but what I'm going to talk about is the right to water movement in the US, where I spent the last almost a decade. And I remember when I arrived in California, and I was working with the Human Rights Clinic there in Berkeley and working kind of on the international right to water movement, and then I became closely engaged with local water movements, and I think that was really the beginning for me for a much more in-depth engagement. And I remember that first trip we took to California Central Valley, and it wasn't what I had expected. It wasn't what I had expected to see in the US. I had done lots of work in different parts of the world. But when we came to the Central Valley, we saw these small municipalities with dilapidated infrastructure, entire plots of land contaminated with nitrate. We saw people's yards overflowing with sewage, water coming out of people's pipes that they were unable to drink. So they extensively relied on bottled water. And that was really the beginning for me to look into kind of what the situation was in the US at a much broader scale, and to become engaged with the right to water movement in the US. And I really want to acknowledge the people who've been in that fight in California and Michigan, Alabama, and so many other localities and municipalities across the country. So there are no reliable figures, but what we do know about the US is that there's a lot of water contamination. Some cases, such as Flint, have made a lot of headlines. Many other cases have not made any headlines at all. But there are estimations that 77 million residents relied on water in 2015. That's in violation of the Safe Drinking Water Act. There are rate increases, there are shutoffs, and overall, the US Water Alliance estimates that over 2 million people in the US do not have access to safe drinking water. So that's not really what we expect in the US, which we see as a really wealthy country, and where these disparities are kind of not justifiable. But what we also see in the US is a really vibrant civil society that relies on the human right to water. And to some extent, I mean, that's a paradox, because the US is not known for being particularly friendly, let's not say hostile towards socioeconomic rights. So in a way, it's the opposite of Costa Rica, where we have a government and the courts that are not open to socioeconomic rights, but then we have this vibrant movement of people who turn to the international human rights framework. So the first question we asked ourselves is really, why do they do that? And there were a couple of reasons. I mean, one was really similar to what we've seen in Colombia, this idea of universality and solidarity, this kind of idea of being connected to each other across the country. And then second, what people found in the human rights framework is really the sense of validation, of being taken seriously, of being listened to, of having systemic racism acknowledged. And by engaging with international human rights actors, people really experience this validated sense of self-worth, which then gave rise to much more collective strength and collective action. And they saw the international, or they still see the international human rights framework as kind of an alternative register to the domestic policies and what's happening at the federal and local level. But of course, I mean, we all know that the human rights framework as such, I mean, is no real alternative. Even if you distrust the government, there's no international actor that come in to then say, well, I mean, this is what has to happen and actually enforce international human rights standards. So the second question then we asked ourselves is kind of how do they deal with that paradox, and what kind of strategies do activists rely on? And there we found, I mean, that they kind of make use of everything. I mean, there's very little reliance on the courts, but we do see kind of this triple-pronged approach. I mean, what Alice Jennings, one of the activists we spoke to, calls kind of agitation, litigation, legislation, and policy. And we see these really interesting strategies, almost like a swinging pendulum, where activists respond to kind of where they see the government to be sort of open to their demands. They try to engage with them. We've seen, I mean, lots of policy proposals being developed, water affordability plans being developed. We've seen activists actually moving into government themselves. And on the other hand, we also see the much more confrontational strategies by engaging in hearings and with international human rights mechanisms. We see this kind of going back and forth. And I think it is this push and pull of different strategies, this adaptiveness and persistence and the ability to identify opportunity that likely explains the movement's, at least initial successes that we've seen in addressing the water crisis. Thank you.
We're getting closer to the end of the academic part of the panel. And in this last presentation, let me share with you, kind of changing roles briefly. And I want to talk to you about our research on community managed water plants. We heard about them a little bit from Maya. She's an activist who's been working and receiving water from these plants and also working on their behalf. And Andrea also mentioned them. So our interest on this community managed water plants came because they are actually the ones who are giving access to drinking water to folks in communities in rural areas or outskirts of main cities where the infrastructure is not in place. So rather than waiting for a government to bring the service to them, they chipped in, literally, buy the pipes and set the whole thing to bring the water from the water source to their communities. You can imagine that they work very different from the way we approach water services, right? It's not that they build people, people don't get a bill to a house and so on. This is community run, community managed. Decision making happens within the community. It's a group kind of type of decision making, and their relationship with water sources is very different from what we see kind of mainstream. And so it's a wonderful local water governance mechanism, yet they're facing serious challenges because of how they interact or how they get to be part of a wider system. And so let me tell you a little bit more of how water provision works, within the Colombian Constitution. After the reform of 1991, we see that water policy is framed from two perspectives, or two tensions, actually, two forces in tension. On the one hand, we have privatization, so it's very, capitalism run, with the high presence of new organizations, new in 1991, based on expertise. So this is kind of technocratic organizations with the goal of reducing corruption in water policy making. On the other hand, we also have a constitution with a long catalog of rights and courts that are vibrant. We have talked here about the Colombian Constitutional Court aiming to advance rights protection. So this too kind of put in trouble the design and implementation of water policy. The Constitutional Court has been navigating and getting it to the point of saying, efficiency can also be in service of water rights. So that's kind of at the national level, the tensions that are in place. At the same time, and I think Bruce mentioned this, municipalities are the ones who are directly responsible for bringing drinking water to people. And they can do it either directly or contracting it out. Most municipalities do it contracting it out. And when I say contract out, it could be either, or for the most part, larger kind of for-profit organizations, but we also have this community-run water plants that are bringing water to the communities. We don't have an exact number of how many are there in Colombia. There are over 12,000. So there are quite a few different characteristics in the entire territory, and how they articulate within this kind of wider frame that I have described is tricky. They do interact with the government. I will give you just 3 examples. I want to be brief. There is a national level registry for water providers. So some of these community-run plants are part of this registry. Some others don't want to be part of that. They don't want to be part of the record. They don't want to be a part of the controlled by the government. They also don't feel supported by it. So why would they? Another example, for them to provide the service, water service, they have to receive a concession from the regional government. So they apply for that, they receive the concession. The goal there would be to make sure that they're making a sustainable use of water, right? And then the third example of how they interact with governments, it would be at the local level, because municipalities have money to support water provision. But interestingly, what we found is that whether these water plants receive money depends on whether they're in good terms with the mayor. And there's a political ideology component here because of their values. They are perceived as communist quite often. So it depends on whether the mayor is supportive of this, community approach or not, whether they receive money or not. So quite often when you talk to them, what you hear is that they don't fit really well within this regulatory government that they're part of, and they reject, they repel any sort of intervention. They do feel the pressure of privatization. Some of these water plants, Andrea talked about Medellin. So in that area, there's been some pressure towards some of this community-run water plants to get taken over by larger corporations, right? There's some regulations in place to try and avoid that, but the pressure is still there. So that there's the question of how we articulate this wonderful local level organizations in this kind of wider frame. It's one that is very important to wrestle with. Interestingly, we find kind of a paradox in them. On the one hand, they don't want any sort of governmental intervention, but they are interested in something. They want their own law. They call it the ley propia. They've been mobilizing since 2016, trying to get enough signatures to pass a law that would recognize them, particularly their right to self-regulate. Acknowledging that they have a community approach to water and to service provision, because they really don't fit some of those regulations. If you don't have more than 5,000 users as a water company, then you're not going to fit in the procedures. You're not going to get the resources and so on. And of course, they don't have, quite often they don't have the 5,000 users. So it's that kind of push of repelling. Yet they want this common law, the law, not common laws in the system, but their own law. So they will get to be visible in the country. Interestingly, and we're looking into this, I think they're quite skeptical. They might know that the bill might not pass because getting legislative support for them to fit is going to be difficult. And I think there's an assumption here, we're gathering data on these lines, that we perceive them, kind of the mainstream frame of the country, as a Band-Aid. They work kind of as a solution to a problem that overall or long-term we should overcome in a different way. So we're just kind of, okay, it's okay for now as a Band-Aid. Yet there's something very different. There are this kind of group-based decision-making units, like water governance, and they are active, they're participating, they get together in this national network of community-run water plants, trying to get their voice heard and questioning, is this privatization the right way for us to bring access to drinking water to the entire population? So this articulation is tricky. We're looking into that, and I don't claim to have the answer yet. We need to bring visibility to this type of tension and situation. Okay, so that's the end of my presentation. With this, we wrap up the academic panel. Let me then pass it on to Charles F., who will lead us towards the Q&A of the panel. Oh, I think you're muted, Chuck.
Yes, thank you very much, Angela, and thanks to the panelists for a really rich set of presentations. I find this extremely stimulating because you have raised a whole host of issues about how popular social movements and law interact on what is emerging as one of the most important issues, I think, facing the world going forward. I also want to thank Bruce Wilson for organizing this whole project. It strikes me as a really, really important project, again, for the future. So my role here is basically to propose a kind of question for the panelists to briefly discuss before we open this up for broader questions. And my question is this: I've heard panelists, both the activists and the academics, describing a range of different ways that one can think about organizing a claim about water, access to water. One can think of the claim as a need. We have a basic need for water in our community, in our household. We're being denied it. We demand that need be met. We can think of it as tied up in a sort of administrative system of local or regional rules and administration for how do you make connections to the system? How do you ensure that this works in a practical sense? And in particular, the presentation on India talked about how that complicated set of local rules ends up framing how people think about making their claims. Or we can think about the basic claim as a right. We have a right to water. We have in fact, it's grounded in international human rights. And one or two of the presentations have said this is primarily how the claim is framed in our setting. So my question to the panelists is a simple one, or two really. Under what conditions does one of those prevail over the others? And perhaps more importantly, from our sort of broader theoretical perspective on this panel, what does or what might framing this set of claims as a matter of rights, what does that do for the process? And Inga Winkler was mentioning how that, what is done for activists in the United States. But I'd like to take that discussion more broadly. What does thinking of this as a right do? Does it help mobilize groups? I have the sense in some of these settings, it maybe didn't so much. Does it help foster a productive negotiation with officials? Is it useful for gaining leverage in court, but not much else? You sort of drop it when you get to the stage of administration. So the two questions are, why do we sometimes see rights as the core kind of frame, and sometimes it seems entirely peripheral to the discussion? And what does it help to add rights to that framing and that discussion? And I will stop there. And again, thank you very much.
Thank you, Chuck. So we can have those two questions in the, in our notes, and my fellow panelists will all be thinking about them. But let's open up the floor for questions either here or online. Folks online can, put their questions in the chat, and folks here, just raise your hand. I've been told that these two microphones are the ones that are going to be working. So if, what we invite you to come forward and talk here. If you don't feel like it, you can also just speak from your chair, and I'll repeat, because then I have the audio. So did I get that right? Thank you. Okay, so this is the time, folks, to share with us your questions, your thoughts, your comments. And if we need a minute for the audience to think about that, that's perfectly fine. We can probably start thinking about the questions that Chuck just shared with us. Maybe that would be someone. Okay, so let's just do that while folks in the audience are on Zoom. Think about possible questions. And I don't know if someone of my fellow panelists would like to start giving a possible answer to the questions that Chuck shared with us.
I can take a stab at the question that Charles raised, because it's actually very interesting when you look at the case of water allowances in Colombia, that it did start with the framing of rights. And it was couched a little bit in some of the rights that had been enshrined in the Constitution. However, that argument didn't go too far. And the reason that was given for why that was the case was that there were other rights that were also protected in the Constitution that were ultimately given priority, right? So the right for the financial health of a water utility so that it can continue to provide services, for instance. And so what we find in the case of Medellin and then in other cities like Manizales that have also adopted water lifeline programs is that the main argument that they were able to work with was one of the need for water. And that need was also couched in terms of what does this need respond to? And that was actually a very smart strategy because it allowed those who were advocating for this to target different audiences. So for instance, one would be, the most obvious and starting point would be a social right? Talking about the fact that people needed water in order to be healthy, in order to be productive, all these things. But there was also an argument on environmental grounds saying, well, when you pair these programs, we know from the literature that when you pair a lifeline program, when you do it at the right level and you target it at the right level, and what the right level means will vary by location, but when you do it in the right way for a particular location, what it does is that it actually helps to both send the economic signal so that people don't overconsume, but it also then helps you create strategies to help people gain awareness of the environmental cost of water. And so by using these different strategies and talking about these different reasons why the need for a lifeline was present in these cities, they were able to do what the argument of the right to water was not able to do. So that responds to the first question. And so I would argue that framing it as a set of rights in the case of the initial cities in Colombia that adopted lifeline programs did not actually do anything for the process. It was a way of maybe helping gain attention because it was being brought, it was, showing up in newspapers and all that, but it wasn't actually the one thing that allowed it to go from a grievance to a policy.
Thank you, Andrea. Someone else in the panel?
I could say a few things about the questions also. So, I mean, it's a different kind of answer, but the right to water as an articulated claim seems to me, and across all the countries we looked at in the Elevating Water Rights to Human Rights project, it seems to coexist very strongly with the framing of privatization, commercialization, governance, and some, so there's a structural context to where the right to water seems most potent as an argument, as the commercialized nature of that supply in the United States, the kind of tariffs people had to pay, or that's one sort of thing. It seems to, that's one sort of structural context in which it seems like a powerful claim. The other one is when things are so bad that it's going to kill people, where the drinking water supplies are contaminated, there is chemicals, there is pollution, there is this sort of common trend of it being tied up with environmental pollution and with natural resource issues. So that's the other context, is the natural resource issues and environmental pollution. I mean, I don't think it's a clear answer to precisely that question, because I haven't but it seems to exist in conjunction with these other two, one of these two possible structural factors.
Thank you, Arkaja. Someone else in the panel? Inga.
I'm happy to add, and I think the questions you asked, are really interesting in the US context. And what we did in our work, we used this framework of different conceptions of power to kind of grapple with those questions about why advocates use the framing of human rights. And what we applied is kind of these ideas of power within and power with and power to, as some attempt at a response to those questions. questions. And I think to start with, I mean, what activists really found in the human rights framework is this power within, because there, I mean, all the struggles we witness in the US, they are very, very localized struggles. And I mean, in many instances, they're very disenfranchised communities that deal with this lack of access to water and sanitation. And I think finding the strength, seeing this connectiveness where they realized, well, I mean, it's not just us in Michigan, but there are also communities in Appalachia, there are also communities in Texas and California, pretty much all over the country that face, I mean, not the same struggles, but very similar struggles. I think that was really powerful. So what I did kind of gloss over in my initial remarks is that it wasn't that clear cut. I mean, there was a lot of thinking about, well, I mean, is the framing of human rights really the best kind of framing, the framing that will work best to kind of their efforts. And advocates did think about that a lot. And I mean, we found that in some instances where they felt, I mean, that the human rights framing would not resonate, they did use other language. So they were kind of, I mean, in particular in Appalachia, in relatively conservative communities, we did not always see the framing of human rights, but it's still, I mean, it was very present, and in particular, I mean, to get media attention, to use during protests and demonstrations in cities. I mean, to use on social media. I mean, the framing of human rights was everywhere, and I think what it gave advocates is kind of this power to work towards collective action, to work in solidarity with each other. And then that ultimately gave them the power to, I mean, really claim those rights. I mean, not necessarily claim them as in going to the courts, where there are, I mean, there's just two court cases really that use the framing of the right to water, but that's only, I mean, at a very kind of to frame it, not to actually make the arguments based on human rights, because I mean, advocates know and litigants know that wouldn't really work in a US context with US courts. But to get media attention, to kind of really present the struggle, I mean, we see the framing of human rights everywhere, and a kind of the sense of validation that I was talking about earlier. I think that was is one of the main reasons to really rely on human rights, because many of the people engaged in those struggles don't get that sense of validation elsewhere.
Thank you, Inga.
Yeah, so I think Chuck's question cuts to the core, and also a misconception about how rights are actually used. It matters by context, and many of the rights, so the way they're articulated is not actually the way they were intended, which is sort of an interesting twist on what we're looking at here. So in the case of the human right to water, we have a special issue coming out, and a number of people in this room have chapters in that, have articles in there. And the intro chapter, which was written with Arkaja and Dan Brinks, actually looks at this question about, I mean, so just because you articulate this as a question about human rights, or think that you're articulating a human rights-based approach to a question, doesn't mean that it's actually the way it was written, right? Activists can talk about the human right to water, and they should, in a certain context, but that doesn't necessarily bring with it the baggage that was written into it by the United Nations. For example, nearly all rights are conditional, right? They're not absolute and they're not immediate. So the way it's written is that you should, it's sort of like the US Supreme Court's like an all do haste type thing. Like, when you can afford it, please get this done, right? It's not, you have this right, it's now or never, right? It's like, we should be moving towards this area. And that makes it very, very different from the way perhaps that activists in Michigan would be thinking about this, right? And it serves a different purpose. It's not that they use it wrong, context matters. And here's another way of looking at this, right? So I have an article that I wrote with two colleagues on this major dam that was built in Turkey called Singh. And what was sort of interesting is there are like 3 different phases of building this dam. So the Turkish government is going to go ahead and build this dam, and it's going to flood this entire area where one of the oldest towns in the whole of the world is based, and going to contaminate water, etc. And it was going to be funded by a number of EU-based banks, right? So the activists used a human rights-based approach and argued with that this funding of these dams was a human rights abuse by the Turkish government. And it resonated really, really well, to the point where the EU banks withdrew funding and the dam stopped. Of course, it was a Pyrrhic victory. The dam is now built, it's flooded the whole area. But the second part of the story is that, well, then the Turkish economy boomed and they had their own dam money, so they built the dam anyway, right? So it was, but it didn't mean, and so that then using the human rights arguments and the human rights-based approach with the Turkish government, it didn't cut water, right? Or cut it, right? Because they were not interested. European banks, of course, they might not actually be interested, but they have to be seen to be being interested, right? And so that kind of approach at that particular moment, I think works. It comes back to the intro to the special issue, where we start to look at, well, what does it mean in these different contexts? Why do people say these things? And why do they use that? And I think the presentations that we've heard today are exactly right. It matters who your audience is, right? And how you articulate this and how you move to the next phase and get the goals that you want out of this. So in that sense, I mean, the answer to Chuck's question is it depends, right? There is no concrete answer, but I think context is fundamentally important. And I think rights, when articulated, don't necessarily mean what we think they mean. We have to listen to what they're actually saying and how they use them. And I think somebody else had mentioned that, I think that Tony meant, like in many cases, they use different strategies all at once. So, right, I mean, and this is the book from Costa Rica, right? I mean, they do protest in the streets. They also litigate, they also lobby. And so these things together, it's hard to sort of like then separate out, well, what part makes what sense, right? And you could be articulating human rights in a protest and block a street. It's the blocking of the street that might be the most effective thing in getting attention, not the articulation of a right.
So we have one question in the audience, but let me share briefly with you a couple of thoughts that I hope will go in a different direction, addressing Chuck's questions. In the Colombian case, although it's one of those cases that we know the constitutional right has been active and has been definitely a release valve as far as protecting people's right to water, I think we have identified two cases where the use of the term right to water is not successful. The first one, in this community managed water plants, they use the language of rights, but not right to water. What they want is the right to self-manage, the right to self-govern. To some extent, what they're communicating to, the government is like, okay, we are in connection with the water. We're bringing water to our communities. What we need is for you to respect who we are, right? So the way to protect water is not through the right to water as a concept, which I found very interesting. And the other piece that I wanted to share with you is in the article that we wrote with Catalina, focusing on Congress. We search all bills and proposed reforms to the Constitution with the search term right to water. And what we noticed that, well, few bills and proposed bills and, constitutional reforms, fewer than we expected. But overall, every time the term right to water showed up, it was like an alarm, and Congress would not support that. And part of what we found is that would get the attention of the government. And it's like, wait, if we pass this, then we're going to be drowning in lawsuits. That's going to put pressure onto our budgets, and we don't have money to bring water, like infrastructure, to the entire country, which is terrible to accept. And then all of a sudden, just we have to live with this, right? So in that context, we saw the use of the right to water was actually detrimental. Some pieces of legislation that have managed to pass do not have that term of the right to water, particularly in the legislative. So that was my piece. Then let's move to a question, Siri, please.
So thank you all so much for the great presentations and questions. And I just realized how wonderful it would have been to have you all here to sort of be able to continue the discussions into the night. But so one of the things, I had lots of it was very interesting, sort of the reflections from this. And of course, one of the things that struck me is that these are, of course, very different types of mobilizations, and they mobilize, as you were also saying, for different things. And they are very different organizations mobilizing. And So you were saying, Bruce, that it depends on who your audience is, but it also, of course, depends on who you are, and another kind of audience. So who your allies are, and in Slovenia, it is sort of an anti-privatization campaign mainly. So it's about water, but in some ways it's not incidental that it is about water, but it is part of a larger mobilization, which is sort of more of a anti-privatization mobilization, or as well, which is fascinating because this 8th of March movement is then transforming itself. It's basically a women's rights movement, a gender equality movement that translates itself into a super effective organization for the right to water to be constitutionalized and to be sort of for a referendum, which is something very different. It's a different type of actor, a different type of repertoire than if you mobilize because you're in dire straits, and because you mobilize because you're in a community where water is polluted or undrinkable or not there, and then you have different types of resources that you mobilize on. So all of this leads in a way all up to a question of, so these mobilizations from below, to what extent do they link to other types of organizations elsewhere, but also in their community, and does that influence how they mobilize? Do they link up to human rights organizations, for instance, and is that why they in some cases mobilize more on human rights and not? So I would just like to put it out there and to have some reflections on that.
Thank you, Siri. We might have the opportunity of get another question, and then we give it back to the panel to provide some answers. Oh, thank you so much. We have two awesome questions here. I'm going to go ahead and read them. One from Meg Strings. The Slovenian case got me thinking about how societies handle access to water locations for community uses versus how access to water delivery for home use is treated in law and custom. Are there patterns in this being treated as two dimensions of one overall entity, water, to which the international human rights framework would apply? Or are the two types of water access typically handled completely separately? Question of property rights versus question of utility access. Nika, would you like to, or we can, I imagine Nika is going to take a second to take notes and such. Or you want to go ahead and jump in? Do you need a minute? What do you think, Nika?
No, basically what I wanted to say about the transformative power of water and communities, and what you also said before, what interesting case Slovenia is, that sometimes we just need to think about water as a value, as something which is basically combining community, solidarity and equal rights. And that's what we did in our community. This was the approach that we needed. But I also think that the next steps that we could have is to start thinking how we could put the people who are fighting for the change on the field, doing different campaigns and academics on the same level. So organizing panels where we have we all speak at the panels, trying to combine it, because the transformative power that we discovered in our campaign was actually that the theoretical community really started to work close with us and we with them, and that we just gave each other tools how to push for a change.
Thank you. So I want to read this one, the second question that we had, and perhaps we can go back and address what City posed as a question before. So this question reads, soccer centers have discussed a multitude of strategies practiced by those pushing to increase access to water. Can you discuss whether there is a counterpart to these multifaceted strategies by those seeking to privatize or reduce public access to water? Meaning, what legal and extra-legal strategies do you most often see to reduce the public right to water? How flexible are those strategies in the face of the resistance you're describing? And which privatization strategies have been most effective? Okay, so we have those two very interesting questions. Does someone in the panel want to take a stab at thank you, Bruce. At City's first question, or this that we just read? I can jump in. I have when I heard the City's question, I thought it was fascinating because to some extent, we cannot think about this, the water rights like movement or actions in a vacuum, right? But in a network and how these actions connect with other human rights, mobilizations or efforts to protect them. So those interactions, and you mentioned, like women's rights. In one region of the country, we saw this in our paper with Catalina, we're seeing it in this paper as well, that the intersection between water rights movements and, like community-run water plants is quite predominant, and this is in Antioquia. And kind of when reading, there's some memoirs of this network, national networks of community-run water plants. And they highlight particularly that in that region, they want to visibilize how male-oriented this management issues have been. So the network doesn't only want to shake up, changing, hey, water is not only individual, this could be community-based as well. And we this way can promote and protect better water sources, but also this is an opportunity to bring to the table, this is not a male dominated field, and this is time to make this visible. So I thought that was fascinating. Other than that, I haven't, at least in the community managed water plants, I haven't seen them as connected with other kind of human rights organizations as of yet. And I would say that highly depends on the region, which is the other element that you were highlighting, and depends on who you are, like kind of cultural identity and context and so on. So I imagine we'll keep finding some, like different characteristics, associations, or not from one region to the other. So that would be my take on that. Some other thoughts or questions from our panelists?
I'd be happy to jump in. I think Siri, the question you raised about kind of what is the right to water movement, I think is fascinating. And I think what we see in the US is that it's a huge array of different organizations. So I mean, there are small grassroots organizations that are really community-based. There's lots of faith-based organizations in this space. There are traditional welfare rights organizations, such as the Michigan Welfare Rights Organization, that kind of come to this water struggle. There are small migrant communities that organize around the right to water. And then there are also, I mean, many environmental NGOs and many really large environmental NGOs that work in the space. And I think on the one hand, I mean, it's fascinating and it works to some extent to have different organizations from so many different backgrounds come together. But at the same time, it does create a lot of tension. We see these instances where different parts of the movement don't interact at all. For instance, I mean, with the recent recognition of the right to water in the New York State Constitution, I don't think that any of the local movements that have been in the struggle for the past 10, 15 years have been really engaged in that. And we see there, I mean, that the right to clean water is connected to the right to clean air and the right to a healthy environment in the New York State Constitution. And I mean, that really came from a very different angle, which is great and was very successful. But I do think there's a lot of tensions around kind of who's actually being heard in these processes. I mean, whenever there is discussion about infrastructure in DC, I mean, who's actually being heard at the federal level, who has access to senators, who has access to speak at hearings. There's a distinct lack of funding for grassroots organizations. There's no, I mean, sustained funding to really support those coalitions. And I think those are real challenges because, I mean, for the people who have been in the struggle for so long, it makes it really difficult for them to actually have their voices heard. And I think then again, that explains kind of the turn to the international and to the global human rights framework, because then, I mean, in that sense, they experience much more of this direct interaction. But I think how to better connect those movements and how to think about really making sure that grassroots voices are heard in the state and federal processes, I mean, is a key challenge.
Arkaja?
Yeah. So, I mean, I'd like to make a point, which is it comes back to the joint paper that Bruce was referring to that we've all worked on. And I think it's quite interesting because, many aspects of this have been raised in this discussion. What does the right to water really mean? Because there is a particular fixed kind of UN definition of what it meant, and which is very kind of, very carefully worded to mean only drinking water and, exclude the privatization issue from it. But the right to water has come to mean many things to many people. And all of those are legitimate uses of that right to water. So when, indigenous people being dispossessed of their traditional access or their community managed resources to land and water, when they say right to water, they mean a slightly different thing. The water right as property is what they really mean. It's just because they also have various vulnerabilities and they are in the margin, we don't think of it so much as a property right, but actually they're using it in the context of the right to water. It's used in the way of fighting privatization claims. It has particular meanings. I mean, we looked across the countries where case law was analyzed. So first of all, for people who analyze right to water cases, it's a tricky exercise to say this is this and this is this, right? Because when you say right to water in your searches, you come to a whole lot of different kinds of meanings of this right. It has a particular meaning in the case of kind of the water governance paradigm, which involves some amount of privatization and some amount of regulation, that regulatory framework, and sort of the commercialized nature of services. So it has a particular meaning in that way of protection against disconnections and rights to certain kinds of access. But that might have been quite close to its originally envisaged meaning. But in fact, people have made very different things of it in places where they've used it. And so, even in the presentation I made, I looked at this drinking water meaning, which is not to exclude many interesting other meanings that have been made of it, even in the Indian context, where it's been associated with struggles against displacement, various sorts of like social inequalities, historically disadvantaged groups. It's had many other uses and many other contexts in which it is used by people.
Yeah, so just one thing on this mobilization and strategic alliances. One thing that courts have done, and certainly in certain countries, is because you can file a case individually, the need for a social organization behind you is somewhat diminished, if not entirely removed from the equation. And we can see this in all sorts of other types of rights claims too, that we've looked at. It could be health, it could be LGBT rights or whatever. That on the one hand, like opening up a legal opportunity structure, for example, allows people to individually file, which may not be, like you as an individual might have an entirely different agenda and an entirely different strategy than is actually probably the proper strategy, or proper in inverted commas, like the one that would be most successful. But to you, this is the one that you think is most important. So like same-sex marriage ones, for example, often were filed at inopportune moments where they're going to get shot down and they're never going to go anywhere. It might cause a huge backlash. But it also means that these social movements are not necessarily, they're not who file in the cases. That's the first thing, not in many of the Latin American countries, at least. And then society-wide, they're not necessarily going to coalesce around the goal because they don't actually have the same goal. And in the case of water, it's often a very, very local goal. But even within that locality, it might be different as to whether I get water or you get water, right? And this, I think, is problematic. And so, and I've been at panels before with the people who believe in social movements as like the guiding force in the world get very, very irritated by this idea that they're not the center of the process. And then if you look at Latin America as a context, in many countries in Latin America, social capital, like the ability or the willingness of people to actually join social movements, is really, really low. Like, and you can see that there's a created index of this. And you find in like places like Colombia, it's low. for obvious reasons, because of the baggage of the war and distrust, etc. But even in places that have had like 80 years of continuous democracy, like Costa Rica, nobody joins anything. They don't join parties, they don't join clubs, they don't join protest movements, unless there's nothing better on, right? It's social capital is incredibly low. So, but we have this idea, and I think it's probably based on the American notion of all these social movements existing and then coalescing together like the NAACP or whatever. That is not the norm in many other countries. And so like, we need to sort of decouple this. We can't keep thinking about what is the strategy of this organization or this movement, because often it's many strategies and it's many goals and it's many different things that aren't necessarily even in harmony. They could be competing against each other for the same thing. And if you think about sort of like even in the US, where social movements are a big player in many of these things, and especially in courts, because you need a lot of money to take a case to court in the United States, certainly to push it all the way to the Supreme Court. But in the Obergefell case of the same-sex marriage case in the United States in 2015, the major gay rights organizations refused to take this case until it got all the way to the Supreme Court, and then they jumped on it and snatched it away from the people who've been pushing this case, right? Because they had different agendas, right? And they thought there should be a different strategy. But once it looked clear like it had gone to the Supreme Court and it was going to be argued, then they helicoptered in, captured the case, and ultimately, I guess it was successful. But I think the point I'm trying to make is that we have this notion of social movements as being harmonious, united, and they all sit around and discuss strategy. Well, that's, I mean, most of the places I've been in and talked to social movement leaders, I mean, they hate the other ones. It's much more like Monty Python's Life of Brian, right? Where the Judean Liberation Front and the other ones, right? I mean, where they actually hate each other, even though they all they agree on the actual cause of the problem. They just don't know how to get there. And I think that's always been how I learned about social movements, was from Monty Python. So I guess that's where I should stop.
I know we're getting closer towards the end of the event, but I wanted to briefly refer to the last question we read here in the chat, acknowledging that we have described as very interesting initiatives at the local level to protect and advance water rights, access to water. But we also need to acknowledge kind of the pushing back, right? Those forces that are not interested in this advancement, right? We saw some of that, and I've been talking about our piece quite a bit, but it was fascinating for me to see how, lobbying behind mining, like companies in Colombia is one of the reasons that has prevented, the right to water to be in a bill or to be in the Constitution. That means that the discourse of economic development, and that the country needs the money that comes from mining, that is, foreign investment and so on, has been a strong force against, like allowing to have a right to water in a bill or in the Constitution. So definitely there are forces kind of pushing back and kind of enjoying the system around privatization and deep inequalities when it comes to water access. And that's definitely part of the picture that we are acknowledging. Okay, folks, so I think it is time for us to come to an end. I want to thank everyone, particularly Nika and Maya, for sharing their experiences with us. Each one of my fellow panelists, thank you for accepting this invitation of the 5-minute presentation. It was wonderful. I know it was hard, but thank you so much. Thank Chuck for the question and getting us started thinking through these main themes that we have discussed. You for being here, City, your question, everyone. Thank you all so much for a wonderful